we have all these, thanks you, Sudha. We have all these different organizations who are networks from all around the world that have been joining us across this entire month and to share their stories. And it kind of surprised me because there are so many networks out there doing really great work, and yet we barely hear their stories. So this whole festival, oh, there's a slide missing. Where'd it go? Anyway, this whole festival is about creating spaces for people to share stories, to have dialogues and conversations about all these different topics. And there's also a lot of practical sessions from how do you set up a network platform, or how do you do self-organization in a network. And so I think basically it's a space for us to figure out how to do all this work together and to figure out how to take it forward. I'm going to stop there because I want to give you a chance to not listen too much to me, but to really listen to Ashti and Wendy, who are two just amazing people that I really love and whose stories are, they've both been doing this for a while and have so much richness to share. So we're going to spotlight, but did I just unspotlight Wendy? Sorry, Wendy. We're going to spotlight both of them. Wendy's going to share a bit of her story. Ashley's going to do a bit of back and forth. And then I think Wendy and Ashley will figure it out based on the kind of energy of the room, where you all want to be involved, whether you want to engage in some conversation or engage in chat. But I really encourage everyone to just, if you've been in another Enact session, we usually do a pause for chat, but because these keynotes are a bit more relaxed style, we invite you to just, when you hear something that really resonates or something that excites you or a question that's really on your mind, to just type it in chat. And we and Ashley will kind of monitor and try and bring some of your questions to the conversation as well. So enough from me. Over to you, Ashley, if you want to kick us off.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Brendan. And welcome to all of you who are joining us today. I'm so delighted to be part of Enact and really looking forward to this conversation. As Brendan said, we want to create this very much as a learning space and for it to be really an informal conversation. So whilst I have taken advantage of the fact that I'm sort of the moderator for today's conversation, Wendy and I are both looking forward to this being much more conversational and informal. So as Brendan said, please feel free to use the chat feature to share any questions, comments, thoughts. We'll try and have a look at those as we continue on today. We do want this to be really open, informal, and interactive. And in fact, I think where I wanted to start before I introduce Wendy, who may be familiar to some of you, is just to actually ask you if you could, in the chat function, if you have already introduced yourself, maybe just take a second to maybe jot down your first thought on what localizing development means to you and how it relates to the work that you're doing, and what you would like to maybe get out of this session, because that would be really helpful for us to have a little bit of additional context as we jump into this conversation. So thank you so much for doing that. And whilst you're doing that, let me quickly introduce Wendy. Wendy, as you know, is the CEO and co-founder of Teach for All, which is a global network of independent organizations across more than 60 countries that are working together to develop collective leadership to ensure that children everywhere have the opportunity to fulfill their potential. Prior to launching Teach for All in 2007, Wendy founded and led Teach for America for 25 years. And she led the development of Teach for All to be responsive to the initiative of social entrepreneurs around the world who are determined to adapt the Teach for America model in their own countries. And, just on a personal note, when I set GSF up just about 5 years ago, conversations with Wendy and her team over the course of these last 5 years have really grounded and informed us as we think about what it means to establish locally led network organization. So again, I'm delighted to be here and to continue learning from Wendy and hopefully to have a good conversation. So very quickly to introduce myself as well. So my name's Ashti and I am the founder and CEO of the Global Schools Forum, which is a network of non-state organizations around the world that are providing quality education to children from low-income backgrounds. We, as I mentioned, are about 5 years old, and we currently have 69 organizations as part of our network, operating across 50 plus countries. And between them, they run or support 30,000 schools and provide education to 5 million children. And I set GSF up really because I felt there was a big disconnect between what I was seeing in India, where I grew up, in what was happening in the education space and on the ground in India, and what was being talked about in policy circles and in development circles globally. And so GSF was a mechanism, in a sense, to connect local entrepreneurs, local organizations, to really facilitate stronger dialogue and to provide quality education in their endeavor to provide quality education. So yeah, with that, let me kick off. Today, however, we're going to look beyond education, although I think Wendy and I spend most of our time thinking education, sleeping education, but we want to talk a little bit more about what locally rooted, globally informed development looks like and how to foster that, and how networks can be an important lever, as Brendan said, to do that, and to do that well. So Wendy, you have said that it's high time for international development actors to shift their approach from defining problems and identifying interventions towards developing the agency and leadership of people in developing contexts. And such a change will enable affected communities to define their own problems, identify solutions, and continuously improve over time. As we in global development are thinking about rethinking our traditional ways of working, how do you see networks as a lever or as a mechanism to accomplish this?
Thank you so much, Ashti. It's so good to be here with you and with everyone and to be talking about this. I think it's a conversation that we should be having a lot more in this realm of development. Maybe it's helpful for me to share how I even came to this, because I must say, 10 years ago, I wasn't even thinking about networks, or actually my sense of time is off. So 15 years ago, but I had scaled alongside many others Teach for America, not in a network way, right? Like in a more centralized way. And, we weren't thinking about the rest of the world at all, but we started meeting people in other countries who were determined that something similar should happen in their countries. And in some cases, they were coming to us saying, can you start this in our country, et cetera. But having been a social entrepreneur who built Teach for America, I knew that would be impossible. I mean, you could not possibly come into the US as a citizen of some other country without deep contextualized understanding of all the politics and all the ins and outs of everything and do this successfully. So ultimately that informed the design of Teach for All's approach as a network. When people were looking for help, we said, okay, let's establish a network of independent organizations with a global organization that will help everyone learn from each other. And the global organization, where that came from was just this idea that, actually our initial discussions with all these folks in different countries led us to realize that there was much more that was shareable in education, and especially in addressing educational inequity, than we had ever considered before. And so we realized taking a long-term approach meant that we would need to figure out how to do this together so that we could all learn from each other. That said, I was so worried at the front end of this, literally the night before we publicly launched Teach for All on the stage of the Clinton Global Initiative, I just got cold feet because I knew how hard it had been to scale Teach for America with quality. And we were doing that through this very elaborate, system of management and control. And I just started worrying so much about how were we going to do this and ensure quality at the same time. But there was no turning back. So we went forth and thought we'll continuously, we'll evolve over time if it doesn't work. And from the start, I mean, I've just been really, really amazed at the power of a network approach. Not only did my concerns not materialize, but I very quickly realized that actually the quality was going up, that we were seeing such incredible innovations sort of driven by both the brilliance of the people across the world and also the diversity of their different contexts and cultures. And we were just moving a lot faster because of this network approach. So it's really led me to think so much about the power. And I think there are many different types of networks, I mean, to state the obvious. And so this is a particular kind of network that we're working on that, to me, when we talk about localization right now, I feel like we're missing something because we need localization, but we also, and the people across our network would be the first to say, like, we want ownership and control, and we have it at Teach for All, but we also want to learn from each other. Like there's a reason that we desperately need to learn from each other across different cultures and contexts, and not only the global South learning from the global North, but it's really in all directions. Teach for America has learned as much from network partners around the world as vice versa. So anyway, I think we're having too limited a discussion in the current realm of the localization discussion. But two, I just think networks are very underappreciated as a path to the kind of locally led, globally informed development that we all want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing in particular really struck me, Wendy, as you were explaining the journey that you've taken, is this piece around kind of scaling impact with quality through the kind of Teach for All network and the kind of global piece of Teach for All, how it supports the kind of localization efforts. Can you tell us a little bit more about the kind of design choices that you've made with Teach for All to kind of support and scaffold that kind of impact versus kind of quality versus scale conversation that we frequently kind of have to grapple with?
Yeah. Well, at the very front end of this, we came up with this theory about how we were going to maximize global impact. And it's very deceptively simple. It was simply that maximizing global impact would take, strong local ownership, entrepreneurship, leadership, plus a global platform for learning and sharing. And that ultimately that would lead to lots of innovation. And, this was going to lead to global impact and maximizing global impact. As deceptively simple as it was, I mean, we could have had different theories, right? Like that theory basically was saying, we need both of these things to be true. Like we need true local ownership, independence, entrepreneurship, and we also need global learning. So every choice we have made, I mean, really for 15 years has been rooted in that theory. So just to give a few examples, first of all, we never get out in front of people, like essentially individuals who decide we really want to launch this in our countries. Now, we may, in fact, a few years ago, we were seeing the propagation of this approach across every continent except Africa. And it was really, I mean, our theory was that because we had just happened upon a really strong Enseña Chile and Teach for India that were models in their regions that ended up inspiring others in their regions as examples, and similarly so in Europe, et cetera. So we decided, you know what, we need to be a little more proactive. And we did go out and build awareness of the approach and how it was playing out across these different regions of the world. But then we still do that in countries of strategic importance where we're not already seeing network partners. But then we step back and wait for people to come to us, because there's something about, where the locus of control and agency and all is in that equation. And then once someone says we want to pursue this, we will do anything to come behind them. I mean, whatever they want. And we do so much to help them understand other adaptations in similar contexts and essentially help them develop a plan, the government support, the private sector support, the organizational capacity to launch. So that's piece one, like how these things get off the ground. Secondly, we very early on, I mean, this was step one, we identified a set of unifying principles that you could write on half a page of paper that say a lot about what we are all committed to across the network, but prescribe nothing. We prescribe nothing. How you live into those principles is completely up to you. And in fact, when people ask for the cookie cutter approach, because, why not? I mean, that's a lot of people's first instinct, right? We won't give it to them because we know they really need to own the how to live into those locally. Thirdly, and I'll just say two other pieces of this. I think people can tend to hear network and they just think about those network partners and how independent and locally led they are. But we do also put a lot into the global organization. In fact, I would say that what a lot of organizations would put into management and control from the center, we invest all that, but we put it into just helping everyone learn from each other and contributing to their leadership development. That's evolved a lot over time. I mean, as our network partners have become seasoned, high capacity organizations, we've been able to get ourselves out of the middle a lot. So it's not just us providing, learning opportunities. It's now essentially facilitating a lot of connectivity and learning, and, lots of communities of practice, et cetera, among, both the staff members and in our case, teachers and alumni across the network. But we do quite a lot around leadership development, coaching and consulting, accessing global resources for the benefit of the network. And then the final piece is that we came together as a network, and this took us a bit, but once we had a good critical mass of, at that time, 40 network partners, we stepped back to co-create a global vision and intended outcomes so that while each of these organizations has their own strategic plans and, they're all committed to contributing to these global outcomes. So that gives us a real mechanism for global learning and data, data-drivenness, which has also been an important piece of this.
Those are some terrific principles to share. I was typing furiously whilst you were speaking, Wendy. But one thing came to my mind, which is just, the impatience that many of us, hear from funders, for example, around kind of delivering impact, right? And so there is maybe a little bit of a tension around whether the decentralized approach that you're kind of describing will generate the kind of scale and quality in the time that funders maybe want us to deliver change. I wonder if you can comment on that, but also just more broadly on kind of the tension between kind of a decentralized approach like this versus a more centralized approach to deliver impact and quality.
Totally. I mean, first of all, I deeply, deeply, deeply believe and just know that the way to maximize impact is this approach for our particular, effort, at least. Meaning, I don't know, maybe we could get better outcomes in the next year by taking a centralized approach. I mean, I honestly doubt even that, but let's say we could. There's no chance that the way to maximize impact by 5 years from now or 10 years from now is to take that approach. So we do just really engage with donors and help people come along and understand this. I will say we've lost donors. I mean, when I think about that effort in Africa, because just about everyone we met, including other very renowned social entrepreneurs in Africa said this approach will never work in Africa. Like, you have to do what you did to scale Teach for America in Africa. And we said, no way. Like, taking the long-term view, this will have a much bigger impact if it's locally led. And I think even just 5 years since the first launch, that's already been proven out. I mean, there are 11 network partners in Africa. There are 15 more in the pipeline, and they are building high capacity local organizations that already have brought in, they'll bring in, I've lost my numbers, but at least 3,500 teachers over the course of a few years, 4 years. And I think about the pandemic too, like I remember sitting here 2 years ago in this spot as the world shut down thinking, oh gosh, I mean, at the time we had 50 network partners in years 1 to 14. And, the world's going crazy and the funds are being reallocated from education to health and the whole bit. And I must admit, I'm thinking how, this is going to be tough for our network. Every network partner, I think it's just, we grew. Our network partners grew by 20%. Our network grew to 63 partners within 1 year. And I think it was just such a testament, like, especially in these uncertain times, right? When everything's so unpredictable, the power, like, can you imagine if we were trying to manage that from New York City? I mean, it could not have worked. It was the fact that we had truly high capacity, locally rooted organizations that were very clear about their missions and were able to adapt that led them to be able to thrive through that. So we have been able to, we have a number of funding partners who just really deeply believe in the same approach. Thank heaven, without them, we wouldn't be here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from our perspective, what we learned was that we needed to spend that time in the initial years of establishing the GSF community, where we really were focused almost entirely on what it means to be part of this community, what are our kind of shared values, what is it that we're trying to achieve, and build that trust. And building trust is, in a network, it takes time, it's intangible, it's difficult to measure. It's challenging for some donors to understand, but it's absolutely critical to build that before you can start to layer on additional things and start thinking about kind of measuring impact. Oh, I see a question from Brendan. Do you want me to jump in with that? Let me just ask one last question, Wendy, and then I'll actually I'll take a look at the chat and see where folks have questions. So please feel free to ask questions, add your comments, and we'll just turn to those in a second. But Wendy, we've seen obviously recently there's this major kind of conversation in aid and in philanthropy circles about localization, about decolonizing aid, about shifting, networks of power. Where do you think, and you and I have actually had this conversation before several times, but where do you think networks fit into this kind of major conversation, and what role can networks play in as we think about these important things, localizing, decolonizing aid, shifting power? What can we do, those of us that run networks, that are interested in establishing networks?
I'm so curious, and I'd be curious about the views of everyone here about why we're not talking more about networks in that discussion. So much of the discussion, we're big supporters of this discussion, right? Like, yep, we need more money to local leaders. And believe me, we have seen that because all of our network partners are locally governed, funded organizations. And we've seen the immense challenges that, irrespective of whatever the localization agenda may be, nonetheless, it is so tough to have dollars go straight to those local organizations. So we are big fans of those efforts and discussions. And as I said earlier, I do think, I fear that we're in a situation where, first of all, our approach to the discussions will backfire because it's so much about just we need the money to the local actors, and it's not clear that we actually need global actors too. And what happens when you try to, the pushback will come if it hasn't already. And you know what, those global actors will have a good point, which is that we built a global infrastructure for a reason. It doesn't make sense for all local actors to just be in their own silos doing their own thing. There is such a thing as global knowledge, as what we're learning in one community that can inform another community. So I think, one, we're opening ourselves up to a lot of pushback, and two, I don't think it'll get us where we want to be, because we need both. We need locally led development, and we need development that is globally informed. And I don't know how to do that other than through networks, actually. I mean, maybe there are other ways, I'm sure there are, but this is clearly one of them. And I'm assuming in 10 years, this is going to be what we're all talking about, but it's amazing how long it is taking to get us there.
I hope so as well. Being a massive proponent of networks myself, you know, I just think about sort of the stories that we hear from many of our member organizations is just the benefit of being part of a global organization, of a global network, just having access to the social network that you have access to, the learning that creates, or the opportunities to access a network of funders and investors that if you're, let's say, operating in India or in Nigeria or in Kenya, that you may not have access to. Hearing those local stories, but collating them at a global level and then thinking about how you distill and share that, I think is incredibly powerful. There's a question here that's connected to what you were just saying, Wendy, which is around beyond partnership and local leadership. How do you maintain power? Is it delegated, shared, or completely taken away? And this question is from Dennis. It's a continuation of the same question, which is, in your work with your local actors within Teach for All, do you have jointly agreed parameters for unifying the network? And I think you spoke about those, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about the principles that you mentioned.
Yeah, we do. So the heart, I mean, we have partnership agreements with each of these independent, again, locally governed organizations. So they each have their own boards, they're locally incorporated, they're responsible for funding themselves, and then they form partnership agreements with Teach for All. The heart of those partnership agreements are these unifying principles, which are things like a commitment to the shared purpose, theory of the problem, theory of change, and vision of Teach for All, and a commitment to working in accordance, when working across the global network, in accordance with our global values. And then there are kind of the high level programmatic principles that must be true if you're part of the network. In our case, a commitment essentially to recruiting and developing teachers and leaders who work in partnership with communities to affect systemic change. And then organizational principles as well, like being an independent organization committed to diversity, equity, and inclusiveness, working in public and private partnership, et cetera. So again, and then there are various other things, like, we have a set of network standards, which are kind of baseline standards for fiscal, ethical, governance, integrity, that everyone meets and that we kind of verify on an annual basis. People commit to contributing data to our global data system to enable network learning. And then in exchange, Teach for All agrees to essentially provide lots of opportunities, for network learning, access to global resources, coaching and consulting, leadership development opportunities. So that's kind of how it's set up. I don't know, I guess I'm wondering who the you is, like how you maintain power. Like, we're not trying to maintain power exactly. Like we want our local leaders to make their own decisions. And as long as they want to pursue the same big idea, the same purpose, the theory of change that unites all of us in the network. We want them to be in the network. We want to contribute as much as we can and learn as much as we can from them. If they, of course, decide we no longer want to pursue this, then they can leave the network and all is well. I mean, they could leave the network at any point, actually. So I guess that means that we're not trying to maintain power, really, but we do believe we can be stronger together. So that's why we do try to keep us all together. Yes, they're national organizations. We don't think of, I mean, the terminology is so tricky and there's so many connotations around affiliates and franchisees and all of this, and none of that is our language. I mean, we really think of ourselves as a network of independent network partners. That's kind of the terminology that we use.
Thanks, Wendy. There's Brendan had a question about kind of some of the hurdles or challenges that you faced as you've built out this incredibly powerful network. Have you made any course corrections, or when things didn't play out as you had expected them to, as you built out the network? If you could give some of those, that'd be great.
Oops, sorry. Of course, there have been so many. Probably the biggest one that's most memorable for me, and again, we've evolved how we work so much. But probably the biggest one that I think is really kind of interesting in this kind of context is that, I mean, we started out with two network founding partners, Teach for America and Teach First. I mean, these were very scaled organizations that had put a tremendous amount of work and energy into developing everything from, admissions processes to teacher development curriculums to, I mean, we had learned so much. And, we did think, gosh, we have a lot of resources that these new partners just starting off can benefit from.
Yeah.
And so even though we had this general idea that we were not going to prescribe anything, et cetera, we still also deep down probably have this idea that we've got a lot of stuff that these people can just use. And I still remember I was on a visit in Asia to one of the partners there. And I remember sitting next to the head of admissions for one of these network partners. And I asked them what they were thinking about. And I mean, I can't tell you how many times in my life I had asked the head of admissions of Teach for America, what are we thinking about? And what they were thinking about at Teach for America was, like the latest learnings on what we were discovering was differentiating the most successful teachers and alumni, and the hypotheses we had that we were testing about how we could screen for those new characteristics, right? So I'm thinking I'm going to hear an answer like that. Instead, I heard that person say about how they were trying to implement an innovation that I already knew Teach for America had thrown away, like did 3 years ago and was no longer. And I came back from that visit and said, you know what? We have to orient our support around questions rather than answers. Like, no more are we ever going to ship out answers to anyone. Like, it has to be questions. And then we can do, we can surface insights, like at the level of principles. And we can have a portal with all the tools and whatnot, but we've got to make sure that everyone is obsessing over questions. Like, we should be making sure that all those heads of admissions are obsessing over questions, and they can even influence what the questions are that we're obsessing over. So that was probably the biggest turn. I also do think, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, we're constantly trying to figure out, how do we get ourselves out of the middle? How do we help all these network partners learn from each other? And that's easier said than done, but we've moved a lot in that direction. Most of our resources at this point go into that versus like providing direct support.
Yeah, that's a terrific example, and actually is connected with a question that Karen has, which is around the platforms that you've developed to actually facilitate this kind of learning. So what her question is around kind of how do you encourage information sharing? So you talked about the tension between questions and solutions, but how do you facilitate and create a platform that enables these local leaders to ask the right questions?
Yeah.
And how do you share ideas and information across the network?
Yeah. So we have, let's see, I mean, at this point, we have a network learning team that, first of all, builds communities of practice. We have about 60 communities of practice, so heads of like functions, you know, and now we have communities of practice among the teachers and alumni themselves who have similar interest areas, similar roles and such. So a lot of our work is around helping to facilitate, inspire, support these kind of really vital, thriving communities of practice so that folks can support each other. We also have knowledge leads for about probably 15 areas, from organizational development to fundraising to teacher everything, recruitment, selection, and the next thing, leadership development. And we have 15 of these folks whose whole thing is both to facilitate the communities and to surface insights and spread those insights through learning experiences, through fellowships. Like we host it, you know, they partner. We also have a leadership accelerator, which is about providing direct leadership development opportunities to cohorts of staff members and teachers and alumni across the network. And we kind of partner up our learning people and our leadership development people to have these kind of really sustained leadership development and learning opportunities. We have a portal with thousands of resources that is heavily utilized, that really, the resources being not only the global knowledge products, but the resources from across the network. And then we also have a coaching and consulting team, which is about 15 people, super seasoned people who are kind of working in cross-functional ways. Every year they do about 150 consulting projects, whether it be helping, you know, develop the new organizational development model for a partner, or the new admissions model, or supporting them to get a grant from the new UK aid agency, or developing a 5-year plan. You know, like we're kind of like an internal BCG for our own network.
I like that, an internal BCG. Robin, I think that might answer your question around how Teach for All supports member orgs to learn from one another. And similar to you, Wendy, we found at GSF that creating the space and the connective tissue to enable our member organizations to learn from one another through communities of practice has been the most powerful vehicle to really surface good practice, collaboratively problem solve, and really move the sector forward, and share that knowledge then with the wider education community. So let me turn now to another question. This is a really long one, Kat. I'm going to try and capture it.
Yeah, and I just read it too.
Did you read? Okay. The question is around how you're placing teachers from the communities and how you're supporting them, and whether it's an important part of your theory of change that teachers bring that outside knowledge to their community. So I think it's where Teach for All teachers are being placed, and the role of community members to contribute to your wider theory of change. Yeah. If I understand correctly, but please correct me, Kat, if I didn't get that.
I would say that what's important for our theory of change is that we place a kind of diverse coalition of people. One of our core values as a network, and we came together around this again when we kind of re-articulated our vision and values, is to be led by people with lived experience. And we have such a significant commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusiveness. And we have been supporting both ourselves and our network to go on really significant, you know, kind of diversity, equity, and inclusiveness audits and journeys, which have really done a lot to increase the diversity of the cohorts. Many of which are placing majority folks who've experienced the inequities they're addressing, and others which are still on that journey. But we do think it is also important to have folks who've have real privilege in their countries. Like we think we need, like the kind of systemic change that we're trying to affect, we need to be led by people who've experienced the inequities, and we need the allyship of people with a lot of privilege who've gained proximity to these issues and are committing their lives to them. So we think we need both, and we think we need to work in deep partnership with communities, which is very much at the heart of our unifying approach across Teach for All. There's much more to be said on that, but at a high level.
Thanks, Wendy. Susie has a really interesting question, which is around what lessons you've learned around for those of us that are trying to establish or move from maybe an informal learning community to become a more formalized kind of network. What advice would you give to set up, to make that shift and to establish kind of a network organization? What's worked, what hasn't worked? And in particular, I think Susie's question is for those who are trying to become more formalized, to deliver a program where there's a lead and subcontractor relationship.
I may not have quite enough context to know how to be helpful here, but one thing that comes to mind is that the very first thing we did in thinking through, like, what would this look like across Teach for All, was figure out those unifying principles. I just think it's such a helpful first step to think through what must be true that will give us enough that it makes sense to be a network. So that's that strikes me as just a very helpful first step. Like it helps everyone. And then there are all these other questions about, you know, how do you think about, I guess, I don't know if it's power in the network, but, you know, do you want an equal partnership where everyone is an equal, or is there a hierarchy of relationships? I mean, very early on, we came to believe this is going to be a partnership of equals. Like Teach for America was going to be on an equal footing with the newest network partner, and we were going to do that knowing that we're going to learn as much from the new innovations as from the older learnings, and that decision has really served us well. But I'm sure different contexts require different solutions.
Yeah, and I was going to add as well that I think there is no shortcut to kind of building trust. And in Susie's example, hopefully because it's already maybe an informal network, they have that shared trust and kind of pulling in the same direction. But I think that's certainly something that we found you cannot really take any shortcuts around. And it's really integral to build that for the kind of vitality and sustainability of a network organization. Brendan, you had a great question around dealing with conflict. So he's asking, what if an organization wants to set up another chapter in the same country? Not sure, Wendy, if that's happened. Or what if two TFA partners end up competing with each other for funding, or any other conflicts?
It's sort of what you just said, Ashti. I mean, I think
Yeah.
it's just so much about, we did start out just knowing that this was going to be really about relationships and about trust, and that's basically our answer for everything. I mean, we have come together as a network. We have all sorts of different, we've got our network advisory committee but often, and we consult them on a lot of stuff, but we also just go straight to regions and we work collaboratively to figure out, like, we have a set of operating norms about how to approach these kind of joint donor situations, but it doesn't even, I mean, we think that's really important, but in the end, it's just always about, like, let's get on the phone and talk this through. I don't know how we could possibly have built this network in a COVID era. Like, I mean, we've been even now, like, we're just desperately needing to get back out in the world.
People, yeah, to make those real connections.
Because it's like so human and working across so many languages and cultures, it's just so hard to do this. I mean, thank heaven for the virtual. We had already built the whole thing on Zoom. I mean, this was, we did that from the minute Zoom started, basically, but without the in-person relationships, I don't know how we could do it. All the things where we've had two different people or organizations trying to launch in the same country, we're very clear one of our principles is one national organization. So we problem solve and put them together, and it's all worked to this point, again, through trust and relationship building.
Terrific. I have one last question, and then actually what I'm going to do is see if folks just want to actually unmute themselves so we can actually see your faces. But I will take, I'll ask one last question, which is Ola and Ira asked, which is, how do you foster a movement out of a network? How do we build this movement?
Yeah. You know, I always think, you know, there's something about, we're very clear about what our purpose and kind of vision is at Teach for All. And I think it magnetizes people who are drawn to that and who really share sort of the vision and values that it's based on. And so the movement sort of builds itself, if that makes sense. I feel like we don't, that's just our thinking. Like, we've created the parameters and we want to support everyone who's drawn to that and help everyone learn from each other so that the movement gains momentum.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Wendy. Should we open it up now and see if folks have questions that they would like to ask themselves? Don't be shy. Brendan, you had a question about impact. Why don't you go ahead and ask that if you're still here?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry. And we have just a few more minutes until we kind of close out. So after I ask my question, if anybody does want to jump in, just to maybe just raise your hand so we know that way that we know you want to say something. Wendy, one of the ways I love to close out these kinds of conversations is through stories. And I'm wondering if you have one or two or three great stories about how you've seen a lot of these concepts you're speaking about applied in practice. I mean, I'm sure you have 100, but some that can really illustrate this for all of us. And as you're doing that, if others do want, since I unspotlighted Ashley and Wendy, if others will want to turn on your videos so we can see you and your lovely faces, we would welcome that happily.
I mean, I guess to your question, I guess what I think most about is how many examples there are of network partners that, you know, because of who they are and kind of the leadership they're bringing and the culture in which they themselves, you know, came to be, are thinking differently and have innovated in ways that have pushed the entire network, like have just gone viral across the network. One of those examples, you know, one of our first network partners was Teach for India, which was founded by Shaheen Mistry. And, you know, they've become so focused on what it takes to foster student leadership in general, and in the context of, you know, how do we create a kids education revolution where we're really partnering with students to revitalize the whole education system. And so many of the principles and spirit of that have just informed our whole network and really everything about how we function. As another example, Unse Poiti, you know, founded by an incredibly visionary and determined social entrepreneur, Nadine Paul DeRoli, you know, pioneered a really important innovation that she felt was really important in her context in terms of recruiting mixed cohorts of not only recent grads, but people who are already teaching in communities and schools who also, some of them had very non-traditional backgrounds and hadn't gotten the kind of investment in their professional development and all. And that proved to be, such an important innovation that's also just flown across our network. So those are just two examples, and there's so many that it would be hard to share them all. Yeah.
Thanks, Wendy. We're getting towards the end. And before I thank Wendy and Ashley for your time, what we are going to do is we love to close by inviting people to actually type into chat something that they might do to take forward based on today's conversation. There's always something that intrigues us or inspires us, and that I think it's useful for us also to think about if we're to move forward with some of these ideas in the next 3 months, what's one little tiny thing that you might do? And as you're thinking about and typing those answers, I see somebody's already typed one in, thanks. Ashley, do you want to give us a few closing words?
Thanks so much. Thank you all for joining. It's always such a pleasure to chat with Wendy. There's always so much to learn, and there's such incredible stories, Wendy, that you've shared. It's an incredible network. And as I said, it's been a source of inspiration for me as I've set up and grown GSF. So thank you. And I think if there's one thing that I'm going to take away from this is just, I love your example of the kind of what you've created to provide that scaffold and support to your country networks. And I think there's something there that I will certainly take back and think about how we can do better.
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, Wendy. As your great comments are coming in, for those of you, again, who's been at a few events, you'll have seen this before, but I always love sharing this because I think this whole festival we've had now, we still have about 10 more events to go throughout the rest of this week, but all the events we've had have been just incredible and rich and deep. And I think one thing that I'll probably be doing as an action is taking this video and sharing it with as many people as possible to help them understand some of these concepts that Wendy explains much better than I do. But our hope is that we, through this festival, can kind of reach new mindsets, new practices, new connections, new collaborations. And we at InHive, we run a network of people who are running networks to try and figure this stuff out. We invite you to take a look at it and sign up to join if you want. We also have a few more sessions upcoming, but just in general, this is just a note to say that this conversation, as we've been saying, these conversations are not happening enough. And so this kind of little group that we have here is meant to be the spark, the launch for something that hopefully will grow. I think Wendy and I both feel like this is going to be the next big thing that comes out of it. And so hopefully this conversation acts as a small contribution to that. So thank you again, Wendy and Ashley, for your time, for your insights, for your energy, for your stories, and especially, I think, above all, for taking the time, really, I think, the courage to experiment with approaches way before others have started doing it, way before we're having this conversation today, and not being afraid to try something that seems totally way out there. And just to close, my favorite way to close is just to ask everybody just to unmute themselves and say bye. And before you click